In 1913, Carl Jung, one of Europe's most respected psychiatrists, began experiencing something that terrified him. He was having psychotic episodes while fully awake. Visions of apocalyptic floods destroying Europe, voices speaking to him in languages he didn't know, entities appearing in his study, claiming to exist independently of his mind. He faced an impossible choice. Option 1. Use every psychiatric technique he knew to suppress these experiences, diagnose himself as schizophrenic, and salvage what remained of his reputation. Option 2. Voluntarily descend into what he called the confrontation with the unconscious. Document everything he encountered, no matter how insane it seemed, and risk never returning to sanity. Jung chose descent. For 6 years, he documented his journey in a massive illuminated manuscript he called Liber Novus, the Red Book. He painted the visions, he spoke with the entities, he recorded conversations with figures who taught him things he'd never consciously learned. In his notes, Jung described how he often felt as if gigantic blocks of stone were tumbling down upon me. My enduring these storms was a question of brute strength. His colleagues thought he'd gone mad. His patients left, but Jung kept documenting. Because he'd discovered something that shouldn't be possible, he locked the Red Book in a Swiss bank vault for 48 years. When it was finally published in 2009, it revealed the forbidden knowledge that became the foundation of analytical psychology. Today, I'll show you what Jung discovered during his voluntary madness. The 3 stages of psychological death, the 3 dangers that nearly killed him, and how you can use his method if you understand the risks. If you're ready to see what Jung found in the depths, comment, "I descend into the unconscious." But first, you need to understand what broke Jung, because the same crisis could be building in you right now. What could break one of the most brilliant psychiatric minds of the 20th century? The answer isn't what most people think. Jung didn't break because of trauma or stress. He broke because of what he called one-sidedness, the psychological catastrophe that occurs when you develop one part of your psyche so intensely that the opposite part violently rebels. For years, Jung had operated purely through rationality, analysis, interpretation, diagnosis, theory. He'd built his entire identity on being the composed psychiatric authority. In his Red Book, he would later write about having to submit to the humiliation of realizing that I was merely a plaything in the hands of forces stronger than my will. What Jung discovered through his own collapse was that the psyche operates on a compensation principle. When you push too far in one direction, the unconscious eventually forces correction, violently. He'd been ignoring his own unconscious for decades while analyzing everyone else's. He'd been teaching patients to integrate their shadow while never integrating his own. He was the guide who'd never made the journey. And in 1913, his unconscious stopped asking permission. The symptoms started with waking visions. Jung would be walking, fully conscious, and suddenly see apocalyptic floods destroying Europe. Not imagination, but full sensory hallucinations. Blood covering the land, civilization collapsing, death everywhere. This was 1913, 1 year before World War I actually began. Then autonomous entities began appearing. Jung documented figures who would simply arrive in his study, not as mental images, but as presences he could sense, hear, sometimes almost see. They had names: Philemon, Ka, Salome, the Red One. They weren't aspects of Jung. They claimed to be independent beings from what Jung would later call the collective unconscious. Finally came complete psychological disorientation. Jung described it as living in a constant state of tension. Often I felt as if gigantic blocks of stone were tumbling down upon me. One storm after another swept through me. This wasn't depression or anxiety. This was what Jung would later identify as temporary ego dissolution. the psyche's defensive structure collapsing under pressure from unconscious contents it could no longer contain. Jung faced the choice every person with overwhelming inner experience faces: medicate it, suppress it, and return to normal functioning, or voluntarily enter it, document it, and risk never returning. He chose the second path. He called it the confrontation with the unconscious. But Jung discovered something that changes everything about how we understand psychological crisis. The descent wasn't random chaos. It had stages, it had structure. And if you understood the structure, you could navigate it without being destroyed by it. That's what the Red Book documents, the map through psychological death that most people never survive. Jung documented 3 distinct stages in his confrontation with the unconscious. Each stage required different psychological capacities. Each stage destroyed a different layer of his identity, and each stage revealed knowledge he couldn't have accessed through rational thought alone. Understanding which stage you're in isn't just intellectually interesting. It determines whether you emerge integrated or shattered. Jung called this the killing of the hero. In December 1913, he developed a technique he'd later call active imagination. Instead of analyzing his visions from outside, he decided to enter them consciously, to participate in his own unconscious as if it were an objective realm. He later described his resolution: "I wanted to let them have their say, to listen to what they had to tell me." The first entity he encountered called itself Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher and the horns of a bull. But Philemon wasn't a symbol Jung was creating. Philemon had agency. He disagreed with Jung. He taught Jung things Jung didn't consciously know. In his notes, Jung would write that Philemon represented a force which was not myself. In my fantasies, I held conversations with him, and he said things which I had not consciously thought. This was stage 1's fundamental requirement. You must recognize that your ego, the conscious personality you think of as you, is not the totality of your psyche. There are other centers of consciousness operating autonomously. Jung came to observe that the ego is a complex like any other. It has no special privileges. It is merely the most familiar complex to you. The psychological death at stage 1 comes when your identity as the sole author of your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors dies. You realize you're not the king of your psyche. You're not even the prime minister. You're one voice in a parliament you didn't know existed. Most people never make it past stage 1. They encounter autonomous psychological material, intrusive thoughts, overwhelming emotions, voices, entities, and immediately label it pathology. They medicate it, suppress it, exile it. Jung's radical move was to engage with it. He asked Philemon questions. He listened to answers that contradicted his conscious beliefs. He treated his unconscious as if it contained intelligence that exceeded his ego's understanding. But recognizing autonomous complexes was just the beginning. Stage 2 demanded something far more dangerous. Jung called this meeting with the terrible mother. As Jung descended deeper, he encountered not just neutral entities, but his own rejected darkness, what he would later theorize as the shadow. In the Red Book, Jung documented conversations with figures who embodied qualities he'd spent his entire professional life rejecting: violence, madness, grandiosity, destruction, raw sexuality, cruelty. One figure Jung called the Red One represented pure destructive force. His notes describe how this entity appeared as a red stone statue, and his words were terrible to hear. Stage 2's requirement couldn't be avoided. You cannot just observe your shadow. You must engage with it, speak to it, understand its perspective, and most dangerously, temporarily embody it. Jung would later write that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. The psychological death at stage 2 comes when your moral identity dies. Everything you believed about being a good person, a civilized professional, an ethical human, all of it revealed as a performance, a persona constructed to hide the totality of what you actually are. Jung discovered he contained the capacity for violence, for tyranny, for every human darkness he'd been analyzing in his patients, not as potential, as living psychological realities demanding integration. He would reflect that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. But here's what most people miss about shadow work. Integration doesn't mean acting on these impulses. It means acknowledging they exist, understanding their origin, and giving them conscious expression in symbolic form, through art, through active imagination, through ritual. Jung painted his visions. He carved stone sculptures. He wrote dialogues between his ego and his shadow figures. He gave the darkness form without letting it possess his behavior. This is the difference between Jung's method and psychosis. In psychosis, the unconscious possesses you. In active imagination, you engage the unconscious consciously while maintaining ego integrity. But even shadow integration wasn't the deepest level. Stage 3 revealed something that shouldn't be possible according to materialist psychology. Jung called this entering the pleroma. This is where Jung's experience becomes genuinely unexplainable through conventional psychology. As he descended past his personal unconscious, past his individual shadow, Jung encountered what he called archetypal forces, psychological patterns that weren't personal to him, weren't from his life experience, but seemed to be universal templates underlying all human consciousness. He later wrote that I was no longer alone with myself and my own unconscious contents. The collective unconscious had opened. He saw mandalas, circular symbols representing psychic wholeness, before ever studying Eastern religion. He encountered Gnostic imagery he'd never read. He experienced mythological patterns from cultures he'd never researched. In one remarkable session, Jung encountered a figure who revealed alchemical symbolism Jung wouldn't discover in texts until years later. The unconscious seemed to contain knowledge he'd never consciously learned. Trying to make sense of it, Jung reflected that my science was the only way I had of extricating myself from that chaos. I knew that such experiences were mine alone, and that only I could give them meaning. Stage 3's requirement demands you accept that your psyche is not just personal. It's connected to something larger, a collective psychological substrate containing the accumulated patterns of human experience across all cultures and time periods. The psychological death at stage 3 comes when your individuality dies, not in the sense that you disappear, but in the sense that you recognize yourself as a particular expression of universal psychological forces that existed before you and will exist after you. Jung came to observe that the individual ego is only a momentary phenomenon within the eternal flow of psychic life. This is the stage where people either integrate and achieve what Jung called individuation, or they inflate, identifying with archetypal energies and becoming possessed by grandiosity. But Jung documented one more discovery, the technique that allowed him to navigate all 3 stages without losing his sanity completely. And this technique, if you understand it correctly, can be used for your own integration, but only if you understand the dangers that nearly killed Jung. Jung survived his confrontation with the unconscious. Many of his patients who attempted similar work did not. In his later writings, Jung identified 3 specific dangers that make red book-style work psychologically lethal. He called this work active imagination, and he warned that attempting it prematurely or without proper psychological preparation could trigger permanent psychosis. Understanding these dangers isn't optional if you're considering deep unconscious work. They're the difference between transformation and destruction. In his later theoretical work, Jung wrote that the danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to inflation that cuts one off from human relationships. Here's what happened to one of Jung's patients who attempted active imagination without proper preparation. A young man began experiencing visions similar to Jung's. He encountered an entity claiming to be a higher self with cosmic knowledge. Instead of maintaining critical distance, the patient identified with this entity. Within weeks, he was telling people he was a prophet. He quit his job, abandoned his family, started preaching on street corners. Jung documented that he became possessed by the archetype of the wise old man. The ego disappeared behind the archetypal figure. The mechanism works like this. When you encounter powerful unconscious contents, entities, visions, archetypal knowledge, your ego can become inflated. You stop saying, "I experience something larger than myself," and start saying, "I am something larger than normal humans." Jung observed this in himself too. During his Red Book period, he sometimes felt like he'd accessed ultimate truth, like he'd become more than human. He reflected that, "I had to make a huge effort to keep my feet on the ground." The only protection against this is what Jung called conscious humility. Every time you encounter something powerful in the unconscious, you must consciously remember, "This is happening through me, not as me. I am witnessing archetypal forces, not becoming them." Jung was adamant that the unconscious must be kept unconscious. The moment you identify with unconscious contents, you lose your ego and become possessed. The warning sign is unmistakable. If you start thinking you've figured it out, that you've accessed knowledge others don't have, that you're more evolved or awakened than normal people, you're inflating. Stop immediately. Jung described the second danger as the risk that one takes the inner world for reality and the external world for illusion. During his Red Book period, Jung struggled to distinguish between symbolic truth and literal truth. His visions of apocalyptic floods in Europe, were they symbolic warnings about unconscious chaos or actual precognitive visions of World War I? The entities he spoke with, Philemon, Salome, Ka, were they autonomous beings existing in some objective unconscious realm, or were they sophisticated constructions of his own psyche? Jung never fully resolved this question. In his later writings, he maintained what he called strategic ambiguity, treating unconscious figures as if they were real autonomous beings, while never claiming they literally existed outside his psyche. But not all of Jung's patients maintained this balance. Jung documented one troubling case. A patient began receiving messages through active imagination. The messages contained genuine psychological insight, but gradually the patient stopped discriminating between symbolic communication and literal instruction. The unconscious told him to leave his wife. He did. The unconscious told him to invest his savings in a specific company. He did. The unconscious told him he'd been chosen for a special mission. He believed it completely. Jung noted that he lost the capacity for reality testing. Everything the unconscious said became absolute truth. He couldn't distinguish between symbolic guidance and literal instruction. The mechanism is deceptively simple. The unconscious speaks in symbols, metaphors, and archetypal language. It doesn't give literal instructions for external reality. When you start treating symbolic communications as literal commands, you've lost contact with consensus reality. Jung was clear that the unconscious is tremendously important, but it's not infallible. It can be wrong, it can mislead, it must always be tested against external reality and rational thought. The protection comes through maintaining what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold conscious rationality and unconscious symbolic truth in tension without letting either completely dominate. He described it this way: you must keep one foot firmly planted in external reality while the other steps into the unconscious. If both feet leave the ground, you float away into psychosis. The warning sign is equally clear. If you start making major life decisions based solely on inner visions, messages, or feelings without rational analysis, stop. If you're choosing inner experience over external relationships, job, health, stop. Jung identified the most dangerous outcome as one where the ego can be so overwhelmed by unconscious contents that it shatters, never to be reconstructed. This is complete psychological breakdown with no return to functional ego consciousness. Jung came terrifyingly close to this himself. After the crisis of 1913, he realized that I was living in a state of continual tension. I could not endure the sight of a patient. I felt as if under an incessant inner pressure. For months, Jung couldn't work, could barely function. His ego, his capacity for rational thought, decision-making and self-direction, was barely holding together under the massive influx of unconscious material. He survived because of one factor: he never stopped documenting. The act of writing, painting, and sculpting his visions created a container that prevented complete ego dissolution. Jung reflected that my saving grace was that I was able to understand that I was observing a psychological process even when I was in the middle of it. But Jung documented patients who weren't so fortunate. One patient attempted active imagination, encountered overwhelming archetypal material, and couldn't maintain ego integrity. Her personality fragmented into multiple autonomous sub-personalities. She never reintegrated. Jung classified it as permanent schizophrenic break. The mechanism is brutally simple. The ego is a constructed unity, a coherent sense of self that organizes experience. When you're flooded with too much unconscious content too quickly, the ego can't integrate it. It shatters into fragments. Jung observed that the ego is like a dam holding back the ocean of the unconscious. If you remove the dam all at once, the flood destroys everything. You must create openings gradually, releasing pressure slowly, never faster than the ego can integrate. The only protection is timing. Never attempt deep unconscious work during periods of high stress, trauma, or psychological instability. Jung was adamant that you need a strong ego before you can safely encounter the unconscious. Paradoxically, you must be psychologically healthy before you can undertake the work of healing. The warning sign demands immediate action. If you're experiencing persistent dissociation, identity confusion, inability to function in daily life, or feeling like your personality is fragmenting, stop all unconscious work immediately and seek professional help. Jung's final warning about his Red Book period was sobering. I would not wish this experience on anyone. It nearly destroyed me. I survived only because I maintained my clinical training and my family responsibilities as anchors to external reality. This is why Jung kept the Red Book secret for 50 years. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because he knew people would attempt to replicate his journey without understanding the dangers. But for those who are genuinely prepared, who have strong ego development and proper psychological support, Jung did develop a safer method for accessing unconscious material. And that method, practiced correctly, can lead to the integration he called individuation. After emerging from his Red Book period, Jung spent decades refining his technique into what he called active imagination, a systematic method for engaging the unconscious without triggering psychosis. But here's what most people miss. Jung didn't teach this method to everyone. He was clear that active imagination is not for everyone. It requires maturity, psychological stability, and the ability to maintain critical distance. For those who meet the requirements, Jung's method offers a path to the same insights he gained, without the 6 years of near madness he endured. The method has 4 distinct phases. Each phase has specific techniques and specific pitfalls. Skip a phase or rush the process, and you risk triggering the exact dangers we just discussed. Jung described the first step as creating an empty space where the unconscious can emerge. Most people never achieve this first step because their conscious mind runs constantly, planning, analyzing, worrying, remembering. The unconscious can't speak when the ego won't stop talking. The technique Jung developed is deceptively simple, but remarkably difficult. Find complete solitude, no phone, no music, no reading, no external input. Sit or lie comfortably, but not so comfortably you'll fall asleep. Close your eyes. Don't try to meditate or clear your mind. That's a different practice. Instead, simply watch what arises, images, feelings, words, sensations. Don't judge them, don't analyze them, don't try to make sense of them. Jung emphasized that you should just let things happen, observe them, don't interfere. This is harder than it sounds because the ego wants to control, to understand, to categorize. After 10-20 minutes of pure observation, something will emerge that feels different from normal thoughts. Jung described it as having a different quality, more vivid, more autonomous, more surprising than your conscious mind's productions. The critical distinction here is that this isn't visualization. You're not creating images deliberately. You're creating space for images to arise on their own. Jung observed that when you visualize, you're still in ego control. In active imagination, something else is producing the images, and you're watching them unfold. The most common mistake people make is trying to force visions or manufacture meaningful experiences. Jung warned that if nothing comes, nothing comes. You cannot force the unconscious to speak. Sometimes it takes weeks of daily practice before anything emerges. Success looks like this. An image, figure, or sensation appears that surprises you. Something you wouldn't have consciously chosen. Something that feels like it has its own agency. Jung documented one patient's experience. A woman practicing active imagination suddenly saw an old woman in tattered clothes holding a lantern. The patient hadn't been thinking about old women or lanterns. The image simply appeared, fully formed, with its own presence. That's when you move to phase 2. Jung described the second step as giving the unconscious figure a voice, but you must maintain your own voice as well. This is where most people fail. They either try to control the figure, forcing it to say what they want, or they become possessed by the figure, losing ego awareness entirely. Jung's method requires a precise balance. Dialogue. The technique unfolds like this. Once a figure appears, address it directly. Ask, who are you? What do you want? Why have you appeared? Then, and this is crucial, wait for the answer. Don't make it up. Don't fill the silence with your own voice. Wait until the figure responds. Jung was clear that the answer will come, but it won't be what your conscious mind would say. It will surprise you. It will often contradict your conscious beliefs. His example from the Red Book illustrates this perfectly. When Jung asked Philemon, "Are you real?" Philemon responded, "I am as real as you are. We are both psychological facts." Jung hadn't consciously decided that answer. Philemon said it, and Jung received it. The dialogue continues with you responding, the figure responding, back and forth, maintaining the distinction between you, the conscious ego, and it, the unconscious figure. Jung described how it feels like a conversation with another person, but that person is inside your psyche. This is disorienting at first. People often assume they're making it up. But if you're making it up, why is the figure saying things you disagree with? The critical safety measure throughout this process is maintaining awareness of your physical body. Jung instructed patients to keep sensation in your hands and feet. This grounds you in external reality while you explore internal reality. If you lose body awareness, if you feel like you're completely inside the vision with no anchor to external reality, stop immediately. You're crossing into dissociation. What the figure reveals can be startling. In Jung's experience and his patient's experience, these figures often reveal psychological truths you consciously couldn't access. One patient's shadow figure told him, "You pride yourself on being honest, but you lie constantly, just not with words. You lie with your silence, with what you don't say." The patient consciously believed he was completely honest, but the shadow was right. He avoided difficult conversations, withheld truth to keep peace, manipulated through strategic silence. This kind of insight, uncomfortable, precise, undeniable, comes from engagement with autonomous unconscious contents. But dialogue alone isn't integration. Phase 3 requires something more dangerous. Jung taught that the third step is to give the unconscious content form in the external world through art, movement, ritual, or symbolic action. This is what Jung did with his Red Book. He didn't just have visions, he painted them. He carved them in stone. He gave them physical form. The necessity of this step becomes clear when you understand Jung's observation. As long as unconscious contents remain purely internal, they remain split off from consciousness. To integrate them, you must bring them into external reality in symbolic form. The technique is straightforward but requires commitment. Take the figure or image from your active imagination and create it. Paint it. Draw it. Write its words. Dance its energy. Sculpt its form. The medium doesn't matter. What matters is that you translate internal symbolic content into external symbolic form. Jung emphasized that this is not art therapy. You're not expressing yourself. You're giving autonomous unconscious contents a body in the physical world. His Red Book contains hundreds of illuminated pages, paintings of mandalas, figures, symbols, landscapes from his visions. Jung spent years on these paintings, often working in complete absorption, as if the images were painting themselves through him. But here's why this is dangerous. When you embody unconscious contents, you temporarily become them. Jung warned that, while painting Philemon, I felt myself becoming Philemon. While carving the stone figure, I felt the destructive energy moving through my hands. This is temporary possession. Controlled, conscious, contained. But it's still possession. The only safety measure is strict time limits. Jung recommended that you never spend more than 2 to 3 hours in active imagination work per day. Never do this work when you're psychologically unstable. Always return to normal consciousness and normal activities afterward. What this achieves is profound. By giving unconscious contents physical form, you create what Jung called a container. The energy no longer circulates purely internally, overwhelming you. It has a place to go, a form to take, a symbolic body that satisfies its need to be acknowledged. Jung documented one patient's experience. A woman with overwhelming anxiety couldn't identify the source. Through active imagination, a figure emerged, a caged animal, frantic, desperate to escape. She painted the animal repeatedly. Each painting allowed her to explore the trapped energy. Eventually the figure transformed. The cage opened, the animal calmed. Her anxiety resolved. This is symbolic work creating psychological change. But it's not complete until phase 4. Jung described the final step as understanding what the unconscious revealed and integrate it into conscious life, without inflation, without possession, without losing contact with external reality. After weeks or months of active imagination work, you'll have dialogues with multiple unconscious figures, paintings or writings or sculptures representing unconscious contents, and insights that challenge your conscious beliefs. Now comes the hardest part. What do you do with all this? The technique Jung recommended involves writing what he called a commentary, a rational analysis of everything the unconscious revealed. He emphasized that you must bring your critical thinking back online. What did these figures actually say? What patterns emerged? What does it mean for how you live your life? This isn't about explaining away the experience. It's about translating symbolic truth into practical wisdom. Jung's own example illustrates this. Philemon taught Jung that thoughts and feelings aren't generated by the ego. They arise autonomously from the unconscious, and the ego receives them. This insight transformed Jung's entire therapeutic approach. He stopped trying to fix patients' thoughts, and instead taught them to listen to what their unconscious was trying to communicate. The integration process requires testing insights against external reality. Jung asked a simple question. Does this insight make you more functional or less functional? More connected to others or more isolated? More capable of love and work, Freud's definition of mental health, or less capable? If unconscious insights improve your relationships, your work, your capacity for life, they're integrating successfully. If they make you inflate, withdraw, or dysfunction, you're being possessed, not integrated. The final grounding principle Jung insisted on was maintaining ordinary life as anchor. He reflected that, I maintained my clinical practice throughout my Red Book period. I remained a husband and father. These ordinary activities kept me tethered to consensus reality when my inner world threatened to consume me completely. The paradox becomes clear. You need normal life to safely explore abnormal consciousness. Without that anchor, you drift into psychosis. This is Jung's complete method, the same process that took him from the edge of madness to the foundation of analytical psychology. But understanding the method isn't the same as understanding whether you should use it. Because Jung studied people throughout history who attempted similar journeys, and most of them didn't survive psychologically intact. After emerging from his Red Book period, Jung spent decades studying historical figures who'd undergone similar confrontations with the unconscious. He wanted to understand what determines whether someone emerges integrated or destroyed. 2 cases reveal the answer, and the difference comes down to one factor most people never consider. Friedrich Nietzsche accessed the same unconscious depths Jung would later explore. His philosophy emerged from direct encounters with archetypal forces, the Übermensch, the eternal return, the will to power. These weren't intellectual constructs. They were living psychological realities Nietzsche experienced. Jung wrote about Nietzsche that he was seized by archetypal contents of tremendous force, but he had no method for containing them, no technique for integrating them, and most fatally, no anchor to ordinary human life. What went wrong becomes clear when you examine the specifics. First, Nietzsche had no method. He didn't consciously decide to explore the unconscious. It erupted into him, and he had no framework for understanding what was happening. He thought he was discovering philosophical truth. Jung realized he was being possessed by archetypal forces. Second, Nietzsche had no human connection. He lived in increasing isolation, cutting ties with friends, family, colleagues. When the unconscious overwhelmed him, he had no external relationships to ground him in consensus reality. Jung observed that Nietzsche wrote, "That which does not kill me makes me stronger." But he was wrong. What overwhelmed him did kill him, psychologically. At age 44, he had a complete psychotic break he never recovered from. The final 11 years of Nietzsche's life paint a tragic picture, catatonic, non-verbal, cared for by his mother and sister. His mind shattered under the weight of unconscious contents he couldn't integrate. Jung's analysis was precise. Nietzsche identified with the Übermensch archetype. He stopped being Friedrich Nietzsche and became possessed by the idea of the Superman. When you identify with an archetype, the ego disappears. What remains is not a person, it's a mouthpiece for unconscious forces. The warning is clear. Nietzsche was arguably more brilliant than Jung. His philosophical insights were profound, but brilliance doesn't protect you from psychological destruction. Without method, without human connection, without conscious integration, the unconscious will destroy you. Saint Teresa of Avila, a 16th century Catholic mystic, underwent experiences remarkably similar to Jung's Red Book period. Visions, conversations with entities, encounters with archetypal forces that shouldn't be psychologically possible. But unlike Nietzsche, Teresa survived integrated. Jung wrote about Teresa that she maintained what I call the transcendent function, the ability to experience the numinous while remaining grounded in practical reality. What did Teresa do differently? The answer reveals the hidden key to survival. First, she had a method. Catholic mysticism provided her with a framework: prayer, contemplation, spiritual direction. She didn't think she was going insane. She understood her experiences as encounters with the divine, which gave her a container for overwhelming psychological content. Jung observed that it doesn't matter whether you call these experiences God, the unconscious, or archetypal forces. What matters is having a framework that makes sense of them without triggering existential panic. Second, she maintained human connection. Teresa founded convents, managed communities, maintained correspondence with hundreds of people. Even during her most intense mystical experiences, she remained embedded in ordinary human life. She famously wrote that God walks among the pots and pans, meaning the sacred isn't separate from ordinary life. You can encounter the numinous while washing dishes, managing a convent, dealing with difficult people. Jung noted that Teresa never inflated. She never claimed to be more than a flawed human, having experiences of something greater. This humility, conscious humility, is what prevents inflation and possession. Third, she documented and analyzed her experiences. Teresa wrote extensively about her mystical states, categorizing them, analyzing them, developing a typology of spiritual experience. This is remarkably similar to what Jung did with his Red Book. Jung observed that the act of documentation creates psychological distance. When you're documenting, you're both participant and observer. This prevents complete possession. You maintain a witness consciousness that can say, "This is happening to me," rather than, "This is me." The outcome speaks for itself. Teresa lived to 67, founded 17 convents, wrote multiple books, maintained relationships, and remained psychologically integrated until her death. Her mystical experiences didn't destroy her. They empowered her life's work. Jung concluded that Teresa achieved what I call individuation, the integration of unconscious contents into conscious personality without inflation, without possession, and without loss of human connection. So what actually separated Nietzsche's destruction from Teresa's integration? Jung identified one critical factor: grounding in ordinary human life. He wrote that the greater your confrontation with the unconscious, the more important your connection to ordinary reality becomes. Mystical experience must be balanced by mundane responsibility. Archetypal encounter must be grounded in human relationship. Nietzsche cut himself off from ordinary life. He believed his philosophical genius elevated him above normal human concerns. The isolation allowed archetypal forces to possess him completely. Teresa remained embedded in ordinary life. She ran organizations, managed difficult people, dealt with church politics, maintained friendships. The ordinary anchored her when the extraordinary threatened to consume her. Jung's conclusion was definitive. You cannot individuate alone. The individuated person doesn't withdraw from the world. They engage with it more consciously. Individuation makes you more human, not less. This is why Jung maintained his psychiatric practice throughout his Red Book period, why he remained a husband and father, why he kept one foot firmly planted in consensus reality while the other explored unconscious depths. And this brings us back to Jung himself. What happened after 6 years of confronting the unconscious? The outcome reveals everything about whether this journey is worth the risk. In 1919, after 6 years of documented madness, something shifted. Jung would later write that the years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. What emerged from those 6 years wasn't a broken man. It was the foundation of analytical psychology, the theories that would influence psychiatry, art, literature, and culture for the next century. First, Jung developed his theory of archetypes, universal psychological patterns that exist in the collective unconscious. This didn't come from reading books or intellectual speculation. It came from direct encounter with Philemon, Salome, Ka, and the other autonomous figures from his visions. Jung would reflect that I didn't invent the concept of archetypes. I discovered them by experiencing them as living realities in my own psyche. Second, Jung developed active imagination as a therapeutic technique. He began teaching carefully selected patients how to engage their unconscious without triggering psychosis. His success rate was remarkable. Patients who'd been in analysis for years with no progress would have breakthroughs within months of learning active imagination, but only those Jung deemed psychologically stable enough to attempt it. Third, Jung developed his theory of individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated self rather than a fragmented collection of competing complexes. He described it simply: individuation doesn't mean becoming perfect. It means becoming whole, integrating your shadow, your opposite sex aspects, your personal and collective unconscious contents into a unified personality that can function consciously in the world. The transformation extended into every area of his life. In relationships, Jung's marriage survived, though profoundly transformed. Emma Jung became an analyst herself, eventually studying the anima and animus. They developed what Jung called a psychological partnership, two individuated people relating consciously rather than unconsciously projecting onto each other. In his work, Jung's practice exploded. People came from around the world to study with the psychiatrist, who'd descended into his own unconscious and returned with a map. He trained generations of analysts who would spread Jungian psychology globally, creating a movement that continues today. But most importantly, the internal transformation was permanent. Jung reported that after 1919, he never again experienced the overwhelming unconscious eruptions of his Red Book period. He reflected that once you've integrated unconscious contents consciously, they stop possessing you. The shadow that controlled you from darkness becomes a source of energy you can access consciously. The anima that projected onto every woman becomes an inner guide to your own psychological depths. Near the end of his life, Jung wrote his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. In it, he reflected on his Red Book period with remarkable clarity. The years of which I have spoken to you, when I pursued the inner images, were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. Everything later was merely the outer classification, the scientific elaboration, and the integration into life. But the numinous beginning, which contained everything, was then. He never regretted the descent. He never wished he'd suppressed his visions and maintained his comfortable professional life. But he also never encouraged anyone to replicate his journey unless they were genuinely prepared. Jung was adamant, I would not recommend anyone to take my path. It is too difficult, too lonely, too dangerous. But for those who must take it, for those whose unconscious is already erupting and can no longer be suppressed, understanding the process can mean the difference between destruction and transformation. The key shift that made everything possible was simple but profound. Jung stopped experiencing his visions as a problem to fix or a symptom to suppress. He learned to see them as communications from a layer of psyche deeper and older than his conscious personality. Communications that, when properly understood and integrated, contained wisdom his ego consciousness couldn't access alone. This represents Jung's final discovery, the insight that justified 6 years of madness. Your unconscious isn't your enemy. It's not a repository of pathology waiting to corrupt you. It's a deeper intelligence, sometimes wiser, sometimes more primitive, always more comprehensive than your conscious mind, trying to guide you toward wholeness. Your unconscious isn't something to fear. It's something to engage, consciously, carefully, with proper preparation and grounding. You're not broken because you experience overwhelming inner content. You're not crazy because you sense realities others can't perceive. You're not losing your mind because autonomous thoughts, feelings, or images arise that you didn't consciously create. You're what Jung documented throughout his Red Book period, a human being whose psyche is deeper, more complex, and more powerful than the narrow slice of conscious awareness you've been taught to identify as you. The question isn't whether your unconscious will speak. It's already speaking. Through dreams, through symptoms, through the patterns you keep repeating, through the things that trigger you, through the art that moves you, through the relationships that possess you. The question is, will you learn Jung's method for engaging it consciously? Or will you keep suppressing it until it erupts the way it erupted in Jung in 1913? Jung's Red Book offers a path from unconscious possession to conscious integration, from being controlled by autonomous complexes to consciously relating with them, from psychological fragmentation to what Jung called individuation, becoming whole. But this path isn't for everyone. Jung was clear about this. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but this privilege requires courage. Courage to descend into your own depths, courage to face what you find there, and courage to integrate it into conscious life. If you recognize yourself as someone whose unconscious is already erupting, whose inner life is overwhelming, whose dreams and visions demand attention, you're not alone. Jung walked this path first, documented everything, and created a method for those who must follow. Comment below which stage of Jung's descent resonates most with you. Stage 1 for recognizing autonomous complexes, Stage 2 for confronting your shadow, or Stage 3 for accessing the collective unconscious. Let's build a community of people doing conscious integration work instead of suffering unconscious possession. If this deep dive into Jung's forbidden discoveries expanded your understanding, hit that like button. You've joined the rare few who understand that the unconscious isn't pathology, it's depth. Subscribe for more explorations of psychology's most dangerous insights, the theories that can't be taught in universities because they require lived experience, not just intellectual understanding. And if you're ready to explore Jung's method for integrating your shadow, the part of yourself you've been rejecting your entire life, watch this next video where I reveal Jung's 4-stage shadow integration process and why attempting it prematurely can trigger identity dissolution. Your unconscious has been trying to speak to you your entire life. Jung's Red Book proves it's possible to listen without going insane. The question is, are you ready to descend into your own depths? Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.